welcome to Mindvalley.
Thank you, Vishen.
Guys, if you haven't experienced Ken Wilber's work, I cannot express how influential this man has been on the entire spectrum of personal growth, spirituality, and way beyond. I mean, I spoke about the book Reinventing the Organization, which is one of the Bibles that, for example, my human resource team used to design Mindvalley as a company.
Right.
And that book was inspired by your work.
Yes, it was.
So I want to read people your bio, just so they know who they're dealing with.
All right.
Ken Wilber is known as the Einstein of consciousness studies, the preeminent scholar of the integral stage of human development, and the originator of the world's first integrated philosophy, aptly called integral theory. He's an internationally acknowledged leader in philosophy, psychology, and religion. He founded the Integral Institute, a think tank for studying issues of science and society and outreach through local and online communities such as the Integral Education Network, Integral Training, Integral Spiritual Center, and he's the co-founder of Integral Life. He is the most widely translated academic in America today, with 25 books translated into 30 different languages. A Brief History of Everything, Sex, Ecology, and Spirituality, Integral Psychology, Integral Spirituality, Integral Vision, The Religion of Tomorrow, and Making Room for Everything. Ken is so influential that this is what Bill Clinton said about his work. This is one of the most brilliant minds I've ever come across. But Ken, I guess the coolest thing about you is that there is a movie that's about to be released about your life called Grace and Grit.
Yes.
I just met up with the producer of this movie, Sebastian, and I want to play a couple of brief scenes about this movie because this is incredible. And Mina Suvari, the famous Mina Suvari from American Beauty, plays your love interest.
Yes.
So let's talk about what we're going to cover in the rest of this masterclass. And for those of you who are watching, what you're going to gain from this masterclass and what you're going to gain from the program that we've created with Ken Wilber here on Mindvalley is really a radical new way of looking at the world. So you show up to the world in a different way. There are many modern lies of spirituality that actually prevent us from truly living in our power. And Ken, you introduced me to one of these lies. It is the idea that spirituality is the art of removing yourself from the ego. One of my favorite essays by you, and I love it so much, I committed it to memory. It was the essay Egolessness, and there's a line in that essay that says, the great spiritual saints and sages of the world, from Moses to Jesus to Padmasambhava, were not feeble-minded milquetoast, but movers and shakers, from bullwhips in the temple to subduing entire continents. They rattled the world with the force of their ego, not some pie-in-the-sky piety.
Right.
And they did so by embracing the mental, spiritual, and physical aspects of their humanness and the ego that is its vehicle. And many of them created massive social revolutions that lasted thousands of years. They rattled the world with the force of their ego. And I find that really interesting. I turned that into a poetic piece online called Buddha versus the Badass. And that is one of the key ideas you will get from Ken's work. It's that being spiritual doesn't mean going into endless introspection. Rather, it is endless introspection waking you up to how you can use your newfound abilities to truly change and rattle and leave a mark on the world.
Right.
That is going to be one of the ideas that we're going to discuss here.
Right.
Now, another idea is that spiritually awakened people are mature and moral people. The big lie is that there's only one way to view or interpret spirit or anything else for that matter. And we're actually going to talk about how one can be highly spiritually developed, but one can actually be an asshole.
Yeah.
And so When you think about these things, you see that often how spirituality is portrayed as removing yourself from the world or being absolutely pure is completely false. And this is where your ideas of integrating multiple ideas and philosophies come into play. What you're going to learn is how to go deep into the essence of integral theory. Now, integral theory itself is a vast body of work, and there are so many books on the topic, and as Ken alluded to, you can apply it to politics, to running a company, you can apply it to your own personal growth. We can't go into every different aspect of integral theory, but you're going to get enough of a taste of it in this masterclass that you will have some massive insights on your own. Basically, you're going to talk about quadrants, levels, lines of consciousness. We are going to talk about types of consciousness, such as gender, temperament, and other individual social behavioral patterns. I'm telling you guys, it goes really deep. But we're going to try to make it as easy to understand as possible, so you're going to walk away with new insights you can directly apply in today's world. Now, the important thing about integral theory is that it brings together so many different aspects and philosophies that you really get an alternate viewpoint of looking at the world. As a result, you become a better coach, you become a better CEO, you become a better parent, you become better at your religion and spiritual practice, you become a better meditator, you become a better person. You learn to tell the bullshit that you see on television. You learn to identify when a politician is telling the truth or leading you astray. You become a better citizen, and you become a better leader, not just for your company, but for the world. This is why it's so important to us to get this wisdom out, because integral theory is so essential for anyone who is trying to step up to rattle the world and make massive global change. But if you don't understand it, you risk becoming what we call the asshole guru. You risk becoming highly developed in one particular part, but undeveloped in other. And that, in some cases, can be risky for the future of humanity. So, Ken, I would love to get started. Before we dive deep into integral theory, I would love for you to tell us your background story, because the life you've lived has inspired an incredible movie, and I know people here need to hear that.
Well, yes, that took place about roughly halfway into my career. I started out, I was a fair-haired sort of American golden boy. I was valedictorian. I was student body president. Voted most likely to succeed, all those kinds of things. I always thought that I would go to Duke University in medicine. I went into Duke, literally, the first day I was there. Oh, I had been, again, valedictorian of high school. Everything was perfect. I was very happy, had a wonderful childhood, I thought. Got to Duke, literally, from the time I sat down, I knew I didn't want to be there, because all of the education I had up to that point was entirely in science. And so it wasn't answering any of those cliched, ridiculous, soppy questions like, who am I? Why am I here? What does it all mean? All those kinds of things. But that's all I wanted to know. And it dawned on me that science per se hadn't answered any of those. And so I was really concerned. And it actually became very, very unhappy at that point. And so I started a massive, obsessive search, east and west, north and south, pre-modern, modern, postmodern, for any types of approaches that actually attempted to help people, in a sense, either wake up or become happy or become self-improved or self-developed or self-actualized. And as I did that, I ended up finding that there were around 6 or 7 sort of major families of approaches. So psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, for example, they had an answer what you had to do to become happy. Then there was like Zen and Zen Buddhism, and it had a different answer on how to become happy. Then there was Gestalt and existential therapies. They had a different answer of how to become happy. And as I looked at all of these, as soon as I'd find a group of these that looked interesting, I'd run out and find some group or some teacher or some practice where I could actually start doing that. So I actually ran down a psychoanalytic thinker and started doing psychoanalytic therapy. I ran down a Zen master, started doing Zen practice. And what I found is that all of these had something really interesting to offer. They were all doing something important. And I knew that they had a piece of the puzzle. But the problem was they really, really, really disagreed with each other. All 6 or 7 of these families had unbelievably important things to say, and they all disagreed with each other. And so now I was massively confused. So I figured in order to be able to get from unhappy to happy, I would first have to get from confused to unconfused. And so the question that I was faced with was, how can these all be right? How can they all possibly fit together? And that was the question that occupied me for the next several years. And this was at the end of my teens and very early 20s.
And you were a brilliant kid, right? I think you've been cited as having an IQ of something like 175. And so you had this ability to digest a large body of different works and integrate them.
Well, that's what started happening. At one point, and this was a big change in my life, probably sort of one of the single biggest changes I made, because up to that point, I had been taught in whatever class I took that they were teaching truth and that this was the real truth, and all the other approaches were kind of confused or sort of right, but not really quite correct. And so the question was, how is this approach right and all the other approaches are wrong? And unfortunately, I'd been practicing all of these other approaches, and I knew they weren't wrong. So the question for me wasn't which of these is right and which is wrong, but how can they all be right? How can they all fit together in a framework where they actually make sense, they actually go together, and they actually fit? And that became the main question that drove me for several years.
I think one of the key things I learned from you is that you can look at things from multiple viewpoints, and all viewpoints are equally valid. But some viewpoints, I believe you said, are more valid than others.
Right.
Did I quote you right?
Yes, exactly. And so the first major insight I had was looking at all these 5 or 6 or 7 major families of how to be self-actualized or self-improved or self-developed, how to become happy, and so on. Instead of there being just one that was right and all the others that were wrong, that consciousness wasn't just sort of this single thing, and that all of these different approaches were trying to take this one thing called consciousness and make it better. But rather, consciousness existed in a whole spectrum of different levels or dimensions or areas. And each one of these approaches was right. In other words, consciousness was like a rainbow. It was a spectrum. And each of these different approaches literally turned out to be right when addressing a different level of the spectrum. And so when they were addressing their own level, they did great.
Right.
But when they tried to address other levels, it was a disaster.
A disaster. And so I remember coming to visit you 2 years ago.
Yes.
Right here in this apartment here in Denver. And I asked you if you'd read my book, and you had.
Yes.
And I asked you, what do you think?
Yeah.
And by the way, if you're a writer, never ask Ken what he thinks of your book, because he's such a brilliant mind, he is going to tear it apart. But he'll also educate you on how to better apply your ideas. So what you explained to me is that my book is great for people at a particular level, right? The level of orange emerging into green, and you'll understand these levels in a bit. But it would be completely wrong for people at the level of blue and red.
Yes.
People who are slightly more orthodox, who are more conservative, and their viewpoints are valid too. But I'm speaking at a different level.
Right.
Now, when you go to integral theory, when you start to understand integral theory, what you learn is how to communicate at all of these levels. And this has a huge implication in how we run politics and how we run the world and how we run our enterprise and how we show up in the world.
Yes. And so I took that first insight. I was 23, and I wrote my first book. It was called, not surprisingly, The Spectrum of Consciousness. And so it went through and outlined these major levels of awareness, levels of consciousness, and how these different approaches dealt with each of these different levels.
So you wrote your first deep thinker philosophical book at the age of 23.
That's right. And it caused a bit of an overnight sensation, at least in those circles that study these things. Things like humanistic psychology and transpersonal psychology and existential psychology. And so I became kind of an overnight sensation for
and how many books have you written since?
Huh?
How many books have you written since?
Well, 25 to 30.
Wow.
But at that time, I sort of became an overnight sensation. People were coming from all over the world to visit and say hi. They'd always say the same thing. They'd knock on the door and say, they'd look at me, 23 years old, and they say, "Oh, hi, I'm here to talk to your father." That was the most common response I got. "Hi, I'm here to talk to your father." And I'd always go, "Look, I'm sorry, I'm it." And so we went ahead and did that. And what started happening, though, is that I kept applying that fundamental question, which is not which one is right and which one is wrong, but how can they all be true but partial? How can they all fit together? Because it became very, very clear to me as I was looking at all these different approaches, and by this time I was starting to expand into sociology, anthropology, philosophy, across the board disciplines. And I was attempting to, again, find ways that you could bring these together. It became very clear to me, as I used to put it at the time, that they all had to have some truth, because it was impossible for a human mind to produce 100% error. As I would put it, nobody's smart enough to be wrong all the time. So there has to be some degree of truth in this, and that's what I was looking to do, is take the truths from all of these different disciplines, and I mean hundreds of disciplines, and find that some of the really crucial truths that they were telling us, and then weave these together into an overall framework.
In short, a theory of everything.
Yes.
Amazing.
And what that turned out is that when you applied that to a particular area, let me take something like, let's say, spirituality, for example. Although you applied, and it has been applied, this overall approach has been applied to over now 60 different disciplines to make them more holistic, more comprehensive, more inclusive. And so we started producing things like integral medicine, integral law, integral art, integral psychotherapy, integral history. And all of these worked better because they were covering more areas that had truth in them. And so if you're dealing with a particular problem, like a client comes to you, you're a psychotherapist, a client comes to you with a major problem, do you want to really just take one narrow aspect when you know other aspects are going to give you truth? Are you really just going to say, I don't want that truth, I'll just use this little narrow slice? Why would somebody want to do that? So at the very least, you want a picture of all the different truths you have, and then you can select which ones are most important for any particular area. But you want to have a menu that's as comprehensive, as holistic, as collective as you can get it.
And so as one embraces this integral viewpoint of looking at the world, what happens to them?
When you start to make room for everything, everything starts to get better. These disciplines work better. And that's why we have, again, 60 disciplines, from integral business to integral psychotherapy to integral education to integral politics. And they all work better in these larger, more comprehensive, inclusive forms. And that's why it made a fair amount of impact, and that's why it got out there. So we're looking at something like spirituality, and we do have to realize that there are at least two very broad different types. And unfortunately, these are confused all the time. But one is often called exoteric. It's what a lot of people in the West think of as religion. And that means, for example, that you actually have to believe things that the Bible claims are true. So you have to believe that Moses really parted the Red Sea, and Elijah really went straight to heaven in his chariot, and Lot's wife really was turned to a pillar of salt, and Jesus Christ was actually born of a biological virgin, and all of that. And that's part of religion. It's not the interesting part. And for almost all of the religious traditions themselves, they have what's often referred to as an esoteric or an inner core. And this isn't a matter of belief systems. These are actually psychotechnologies of consciousness transformation. These are ways, for example, in Zen Buddhism, where you practice and actually have a waking up. You have a satori, you have an enlightenment, an awakening. That's not a mythic story. That's a direct, immediate, first-person realization. And it shows you a profound, profound degree of ultimate reality for this universe. And anybody who studied this carefully, including even people like the internet star Jordan Peterson, has said flat out that the evidence for these two types of consciousnesses, namely your ordinary, typical, isolated consciousness, and this what he calls absolute consciousness, where you're one with absolutely everything. And in the entire universe is arising within your own absolute consciousness. That's the waking up that we're talking about. And so whether we call it enlightenment, awakening, metamorphosis, satori, moksha, the great liberation, this is the real core of the waking up traditions. So these waking up types of experiences, we have evidence for those going back thousands of years. And they make the actual core of the world's great wisdom traditions, whether it's Judaism, Taoism, Vedanta, Buddhism, Islam. You find some small sect that are devoted to these waking up experiences. And this is where you go from thinking that, oh, you're just a separate, isolated individual self that is suffering the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. It's life is suffering, life is painful, it's horrible. And then you have this awakening where you realize that you're one with the ground of all being. And that's a profound liberation move. So it's called the Great Liberation. And this is maintained by the traditions to be ultimate truth. It's not relative consciousness, it's absolute consciousness. And the point is, you can have those experiences. They are profound. And they really are the core, the often hidden core of the world's great spiritual traditions.
And what you really touched on was one of the 5 aspects of the Aqual framework.
Yes.
Waking up, right? And you say that this is a state change, meaning one could have a momentary feeling of connection to oneness, and the very next day that person could still feel miserable and depressed. And you also say that these state changes fluctuate, and they have no bearing on morality. In other words, a saint could certainly have the power to heal people, but he could also be abusing people behind the scenes.
Well, this is what's so strange. One of the things that an integral approach shows us is that the more we look into all the different areas of human activity, that an enormous number of the really crucial, important things in those areas aren't obvious. You don't see it. They're not just standing out there and you can just see them without any problem. I mean, if you think about it, most of the things that human beings consider that have a real existence are things that nobody's ever seen or experienced. Nobody's ever seen an electron, an average person. Nobody's ever experienced an atom or a molecule or a cell or the immune system or brain neurophysiology or distant planets. But we accept the truth of all of those. But in order to find those, that was a fair amount of work over several hundred years to discover electrons, discover atoms, discover molecules. So it turns out the same is true in these areas of human life and living, like waking up and growing up and showing up and cleaning up. These are all areas that, like atoms, molecules, cells, you can't see them, they're not obvious, but they're there. And this particularly becomes profoundly important when we look at not just waking up, but another item called growing up.
And just to give a preface, okay? So the Aqua framework has 5 elements: showing up, growing up, opening up, waking up, and cleaning up. And right now, we're gonna, for the sake of simplicity, look at the difference between waking up and growing up.
Right. Because what it turns out is that waking up, because it's a direct first-person experience, when you have a waking up experience, you know it. If you're meditating and all of a sudden you feel one with the entire universe in love and bliss, you know it. It's completely obvious, no doubt about it. Growing up, on the other hand, well, this was such a complex, it's ultimately fairly simple, but it started out as such a complex area, very important area of human reality, that it wasn't even discovered until about 100 years ago. So waking up's going back, we discovered that several thousand years ago, because it's a first-person obvious
because
experience.
Thousands of years ago, the Buddha was meditating under a Bodhi tree, waking up.
Yes. And so, but all of a sudden with growing up, these actually refer to the stages of development that all human beings go through as they grow and evolve in a typical life. And one of the things about those stages of growing up is that if you look within, you can't see them. They're much more like rules of grammar. So anybody that's brought up speaking in a particular culture, speaking that culture's language, they end up speaking that language quite accurately. They put subject and verbs together correctly. They use adjectives and adverbs correctly. In other words, they follow the rules of grammar of that language quite correctly. But if you ask any of them, write down all those rules of grammar that you're following so accurately. Almost none of them can do it. Most of them don't even know that they're following these elaborate rules of grammar that govern how they parse, edit, divide their entire experiences. We're using it all the time. You and I are doing that right now. So it turns out that these stages of development, and I'll give some examples, brief examples of those in just the next moment, so people can see what we're talking about. But the rules of those stages of development are like grammar. And so you can't look within and see them. Just like right now, you and I can't look within and see the rules of grammar that we're still following so accurately. That's what these stages of growing up are like. And so because of that, they really weren't discovered until around 100 years ago. But here's what's so profound about those. Oh, and by the way, by being discovered only around 100 years ago, there's not a single religious system anywhere in the world that includes stages of growing up, because these were discovered way too recently to be put in these great religious traditions that are sometimes thousands of years old.
And that's a powerful insight, and it's going to make sense to you in a moment.
Right. So what are examples of stages of growing up? I did a book called Integral Psychology, and in that book I analyzed over 100 models of stages of growing up. And I actually have charts in the back of the book that has all 100 of these models listed with the names of the stages of growing up that they have. And what's so astonishing is that the great similarity that all of these models have of these stages of growing up. And so most of them have, on average, about 6 to 8 major stages of growing up. But some have fewer stages, some have more. But 6 to 8's the rough average. Now, what I'm going to do now, as an example, is give a simplified one that just has 4 major stages, so people can see what those are. And these were ones that were discovered by a woman studying the stages of moral development in women. Now, she also discovered that the same major stages occurred in men, but in what she called a different voice. In other words, men tended to go through these moral stages talking about things like autonomy and rights and justice. And women tended to go through the same stages, but talking about relationship and care and responsibility. There were exceptions. We're not pigeonholing people here. But her first stage, she called selfish, simply because the woman cares only for herself, and that's it. Then the next stage she called care, because the woman extends care from just herself to a whole group. And we sometimes call the first stage egocentric and the second stage ethnocentric, because you're expanding your identity to an ethnic
to an
group
ethnic
or
group
crowd.
or religion or people of your skin color.
Right.
Yeah.
And then that group tends to be the important group, and other groups are looked at with a little bit of suspicion. So those other groups are now the great other.
Right.
And that is
The people,
problematic.
the people you want to build a wall between.
Yeah. And it's us versus them. And then the next stage she called not care, but universal care. And that's very important. That's where we look at all groups and try to treat all people fairly, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed. That's a very, very important and very recent development. And so we also call that world-centric. So we're going from egocentric, selfish, to ethnocentric care, to world-centric, universal care. And then her highest stage she called integrated, because it tends to integrate and understand all of the previous stages. Now, if you just look at that, and you realize that because what these are actual functions of the mind. And so these are interpretive grids that will interpret any experience we have. And that means we'll also interpret our waking up experiences according to these stages of growing up.
So I want to come to that in a moment, because that was a major insight for me.
It's
a
huge.
ridiculously major insight. But first I want to share a story, a modern story, so
Sure.
The audience will understand that. So if you think of it as a grid, okay, the x-axis is waking up. And waking up is called a state change, because honestly, you could take ayahuasca and have a feeling of connectedness to all life, but it's going to dissipate after a couple of hours, right? So waking up happens rapidly and you move in and out of it. Now, that is a state change. Now, the y-axis is what Ken is now talking about. And this is growing up, and this is a stage evolution. You don't grow up suddenly, you grow up over time.
Right.
And Ken, I believe what you've said is that the egocentric state was the state that humanity was in, I guess, 20,000 years ago, when if you saw a bison that you were about to kill, and there was another hunter from a different tribe, you might kill him to get to the bison, because it's all about survival and feeding yourself.
Right.
But as we mature as civilization, we move up to ethnocentric. The great religious traditions of our time originated during ethnocentric stages.
Yes.
So it's all about love and compassion, but to people of your religion and skin.
That's right.
Which is why things like the Crusades happen, right? Or the expansion of the Islamic world by conquest.
Yes.
It was ethnocentric, nothing wrong there. But today, the world is only 70% ethnocentric.
Right.
30%, you said, have moved to world-centric.
Right.
The world-centric people are the people who approve of ideas that bridge the gaps between different cultures. The EU, for example, came from world-centric identity, whereas the Trump border wall comes from an ethnocentric worldview, that there's a separation and a division between us and them, between, in this case, Mexicans and Americans. Americans can see themselves as kind and compassionate to other Americans, or at least ethnocentric Americans are, but the Mexican kids who are crossing illegally, let's separate them from their parents. We don't care, they're not us. So that is the danger of the ethnocentric worldview in a world that's becoming more linked. Now, when you go all the way to the top, integrated, you've also called that cosmocentric.
Yes.
Right? And that is a worldview where, from what I understand, you expand your level of inclusivity, not just to people all across the world, but all life, and multiple generations down.
Yes.
And including all life in the cosmos.
Yes.
So if a disgusting alien landed and he opened his mouth and he had tentacles emerging from his mouth,
right,
you would still go and give him a hug because he's sentient and he's life.
Now,
would that be a way of explaining it?
Yes, yes. And here's one of the, in a sense, kind of alarming things about the fact that waking up and growing up have never, ever appeared in a system together. That's what's alarming. And so if you look at the era when the great waking up traditions were first introduced, Zen Buddhism, Advaita Vedanta, contemplative Taoism, Sufism, I mean, these major, major paths of waking up and enlightenment and metamorphosis and just what we call waking up, these were stunning. But they're still going to get interpreted in ethnocentric terms. Right. And so every one of the cultures that introduced these great waking up, great religious traditions, every one of those cultures had slavery, because ethnocentric interpretive grids have no objection to slavery. Buddhist monasteries had slaves. Christian monasteries had slaves. St. Paul recommends to slaves, obey your master and love Jesus Christ. Really? That's the recommendation to a slave from a religious stance?
Right.
It's horrifying.
And yet it wasn't necessarily wrong in that time.
For them.
For them.
Aristotle wrote all about it. He saw no objection to slaves at all. And part of the reason is that the cultural background is at this ethnocentric stage of development. So by the time we move up into world-centric stages, which didn't start to emerge until around the Western Enlightenment, that started to introduce on a fairly large cultural stance things like rational forms of knowledge and awareness. And so in a few hundred period, starting around 1600, we have literally the emergence of all of the modern sciences: modern physics, modern chemistry, modern biology, modern astronomy, and so on. And very telling, because all of these ethnocentric and earlier means egocentric, means the original tribal societies, 15% of them had slaves. So they had no problem with that. So all of a sudden, when you get to the emergence of universal care with its rational underpinnings, then in a 100-year period, from 1770 to 1870, slavery is outlawed in every major rational industrial country on the face of the planet, because that growing up developmental sequence had now moved up into world-centric morals. So it's not just us versus them, it's all of us. That had never happened. And so that's what's so extraordinary about these waking up and growing up. And incidentally, during the Western Enlightenment, when growing up was moving forward, there was a drop-off in interest in waking up. It just wasn't as much of that, because now they were really focused on science and rationality. And so then we got this integrated stage that's just starting to emerge now. So the question is, if you're taking up a path of waking up and you want to, have this great liberation in your own life, you want to discover the ground of all being, you want to discover this fundamental enlightenment and awakening. And by the way, you can. That's a real state of consciousness. You can realize that. But you're going to interpret it according to the stage of growing up that you're at. And so if you're at ethnocentric, then you're going to interpret that waking up, even though you feel one with absolutely everything. And then let's say, just for example, you're a fundamentalist Christian. Fundamentalist Christians can have these waking up experiences. As a matter of fact, about 60% of them do. And they're authentic waking up experiences. And so they'll say, oh, yes, everybody can have this waking up experience if and only if you accept Jesus Christ as your personal Savior.
And to them it's real because they have experienced this closeness, except that from their lens, they perceive it as only Jesus can get you there.
That's right. And so for Christian fundamentalists, for example, they just can't imagine there being Hindus in heaven.
Right.
That just doesn't work for them. So they have this ethnocentric, meaning group. This group is right, other groups are wrong.
Now, what happens when you expand your worldview to world-centric? What then do you perceive as
among other things,
a unity
you start to
experience?
get what we call universal rights of human beings. During the Middle Ages, with ethnocentric background, even though there was waking up and some of these other areas that we could talk about, like showing up and so on, but during the Middle Ages, you had this ethnocentric background, even though some people are sort of thinking rationally, it's in the context of this group is right, that group isn't. So if you're a Christian in the Middle Ages in Europe, and you die and go to heaven, then you're going to sit in the right, and you've been a good Christian. You're going to sit on the right-hand side of God, and you're going to, and Jesus is going to be sitting there with you, and you're going to live that life for everlasting, eternal time. And then all of the people who are actually having fun and are kind of interesting, they're all down in hell. But you're up in heaven with these absolutely boring, horrifying people. But that's the point. Rights were not extended to all people. With the beginning of the Western Enlightenment, all of a sudden we see treatises, long philosophical papers on the universal rights of human beings. That was a new concept. It wasn't, oh, you have rights if you're a Christian. If you're not a Christian, you don't have rights.
Right.
With universal rights, all of a sudden, we switch from monarchy to democracy. Now, everybody has rights. Now, these rights were originally applied to the people that already had them. So they were applied to white, European, able-bodied, cisgendered, heteronormative human males. But the principles themselves that they conceived applied to everybody. And that's what happened. We kept applying those universal rights to everybody. So we extended it to black people. Women got the right to vote. We extended it to homosexuals. We're extending it now to transgender, because that was the universal nature of these principles. And that's growing up. That's the whole process
now,
of growing up.
when you get to the world-centric stage, how would one see an experience of connection, a unity experience, right? You mentioned that a fundamentalist Christian, someone at the ethnocentric stage, not that there's anything wrong there, would see it as, oh, Jesus brought me here. We all need to embrace Jesus. But if you're at the world-centric stage, how would you perceive that same experience? Then
that becomes an inherent right of all human beings, regardless of race, color, sex, creed, religion, nationality. That was the whole point of moving into what's sometimes called a cosmopolitan view. In other words, not just French, not just German, not just Hindu, not just Jewish, cosmopolitan, a universal human being, with every human being having the same set of universal rights and freedoms. This was unheard of. That's why we didn't get rid of slavery until then. And what's shocking is we had slavery until just 200 years ago. Really? It took us that long to realize that one person owning another person is wrong? Well, yeah, because growing up was proceeding that slowly. Even though waking up had been around for thousands of years, that didn't get rid of slavery.
But the question then is, Ken, when you get to the world-centric level, how would you perceive a religious or spiritual experience of being connected to oneness? How is that interpreted at that level?
So the fundamental experience of waking up is this experience if you are one with everything, absolutely one with everything. You're one with what's often called the ground of all being. And that's what this satori, or awakening, or realization, that's a direct kind of impact that you could hit with. Now, the problem is, those waking up experiences don't tell you specifically hardly anything about an actual individual finite thing.
So what you're saying is that the satori moment, that feeling of connectedness with all that you might get through, say, an ayahuasca experience or a meditative experience, right? You're going to interpret it based on your level of growing up.
That's correct.
So if you're at the ethnocentric level and you believe that your religion is it, you're going to say, well, my religion just did this. Way to go, Islam, or way to go, Jesus.
Right.
Now, if you're at the world-centric level, what would you see? How would you interpret it?
Then that has because what the growing up side is adding is this individual identity, this interior finite identity that you have. Are you identified with just yourself? Are you identified with just your tribe, just your group? Or are you identified with all groups, with all human beings? Because that's what's going to tell you how many people can have.
So a world-centric person experiencing a satori experience would simply conclude, wow, I did this through meditation. Everyone should try this.
Yes. But now you feel one with everybody, even if you're down at egocentric, but you won't understand these interior identity. And that's what makes growing up so absolutely fundamental.
Right.
If you don't have some degree of growing up that goes into world-centric or integral, then you're going to, and this is absolutely possible, what you could end up with is an enlightened Nazi.
An enlightened
literally.
Nazi, yes. So let's talk about that, because this is a really, really important idea. When I've shared this idea of yours on the stage, I share the story of the asshole guru. So the idea here, and this explains why so many people who are seen as spiritual legends sometimes get exposed for being frauds or get exposed for all the dark side of egocentric or ethnocentric ideas, including sexual harassment and so on. So I was once asked around 10 years ago to help support an Indian saint who had come to America and had been proven by scientists to have these mystical abilities to accelerate healing in plants and animals and human beings. But there was one problem with him. While he had this ability and scientists were studying him and they were baffled by him, he was a sexist, he was a racist, he was an asshole, and I had a contract with him to build his website. And one day while meeting with him, one of my team members walks in the room, a Latin guy. And this saint sees this guy walk in, not realizing that this guy is part of my team and is there to help with the meeting we were having, and yells at him, "Who the fuck are you? How dare you walk in? How dare you interrupt our meeting? You, get out of here, you Mexican." And I was thinking, what the hell is going on? That was my Argentinian business partner.
Right.
And then and there I realized that this guy was at the wrong level of development. he was racist.
Right.
It was later proven that he was highly sexist
Yep.
and had been sexually harassing women on his own team.
Yep.
And so seeing how he treated a member of my team, the very next day, I canceled the contract. We lost $50,000. But I realized that I was dealing with a guy who was highly dangerous. Now, I didn't have the tools that you're providing now.
Yeah.
I didn't have that matrix. But today, every time I work with a new teacher that we are bringing onto Mindvalley, I use this particular matrix, and I'm going to put it on the screen right now, so that I can see that, yes, they might have access to incredible spiritual energy, but are they
And we're not taking
ethnocentric,
away from that.
world-centric, or cosmocentric? And I want to work with people
Yes.
who are cosmocentric.
Yes.
So you can see a direct application of this framework in making the right business decisions.
Yes.
Now, how do I tell if someone is cosmocentric? Really simple. I ask them what they stand for.
Yeah.
And I love working with authors who speak about how they want to stand for global unity or the environment and so on. And that's a really good indicator that one has grown up to a level that is more inclusive. So humanity is growing up, right? In the last couple of 100 years, we've abolished slavery, we have formed the United Nations, but still we're having debates in many countries today on nationalism versus more inclusive politics. If you look at the United States, there was a huge debate about the border wall.
Yes.
The president, who is currently running the country,
Yes.
won on a platform of inciting hate
Yes.
and judgment on basically just about everyone who was brown.
Yes.
So what's going on there? Is that a regression? Are
Yeah.
they different levels of world centrism?
Well, here's the problem. And it's not that just any one of these are all good or all bad. The whole point is that these are developmental processes. And you can go through developmental processes in waking up, and we might talk about that a little bit later, but just very briefly, most of the great spiritual traditions with meditative traditions have a series of stages of waking up. Now, you can have an immediate peak experience of ultimate unity consciousness, but if you want that to be a permanent realization, a permanent access, then there are usually a series of stages that most of the traditions have, and they help you move through these stages until you get more and more and more fully adopted to a waking up that you can have more or less 24/7. And then there's also growing up stages, and we're giving just these 4 simple ones. Again, many of them have, around 6 to 8 stages of growing up, but each of these build on its predecessor. So in growing up, one of the main things we find is that author Kessler invented a term called holon. And a holon is a whole that's a part of a larger whole. Now, pretty much everything in the universe is a holon. So whole quarks come together to form whole atoms come together to form whole molecules come together to form whole cells form whole organisms, and so on. The universe is winding up into greater and greater and greater holons. It's not winding down, it's winding up. And what we see in human growing up is that the whole of one stage becomes a part of the whole of the next stage. And then the whole of that stage becomes a part of the whole of the next stage. So what we're seeing is that these really are important steps, and we need to go through all of them. We can't bypass any of them, like we can't go from atoms to cells and skip molecules. These are stages that have unfolded over evolutionary time, and they're there for a real reason. And so we really do have to grow through these. And one of the important stages, everybody goes through it, is the ethnocentric stage. And so that's one of the real problems, is that we have to realize that and take that into account in our social policies. But then we go from ethnocentric into world-centric, and then from world-centric into cosmocentric. And cosmocentric is almost certainly going to include some sort of worldwide, not necessarily a strong world federation, But we are growing together more and more and more, and it's unavoidable.
How far ahead do you think are we from a world federation of nations? I'm not talking about the United Nations, I'm talking about an Earth flag. I'm talking about human beings identifying themselves as citizens of spaceship Earth.
Right.
First.
Right.
And then citizen of their country. So that the flag that they're wearing on their backpack or the flag on the rockets going to the moon is an Earth flag. How far are we?
Well, right now, it's the numbers are a little bit disturbing, because what we find, and depending on which model you use, you get slightly different percentages, but it looks like around 60 to 70% of the world's population are ethnocentric or lower. So our problem right now is the particularly best and brightest do tend to move into world-centric. So they're arguing, we have to include everything. We don't want boundaries. But you have to be very careful, because then when you get into cosmocentric, then you also see the ways in which all of these earlier stages have to be carefully fit with one another. So we do need a stage of ethnocentric, and then we need world-centric institutions, and then cosmocentric.
And that brings us to a very interesting concept over here, which is that when you move to integral, as the name suggests,
yes,
you're integrating all the
yes,
individual stages. For example, when you're going from egocentric to ethnocentric, you're not saying, oh, I'm just going to give myself to my religion or my tribe. I don't matter. You still matter. But
yes,
you are also supporting your country or your religion or your tribe. When you move to world-centric, you're not saying, let's destroy all human culture and have
right,
one global culture. You might still appreciate festivals from unique religions and cultures. You might celebrate Christmas and Holi and fast during Ramadan. But at the same time, you are world-centric.
Right.
But you are also appreciating the beauties of individual culture.
Right.
So that is enfolding.
Yes, and it does look like we need all of these different elements, from egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric. There has to be some place that those are still located, not as rigid. So if you're just at ethnocentric, then you want walls everywhere.
Yes.
And that's what we had in all of our ethnocentric periods. People were building, the Great Wall of China.
Right.
People were building walls everywhere.
So we've done a really interesting job going deep into waking up and growing up. But in the Aqual model, which is what the Ken Wilber program on Mindvalley is all about, right? We go so much deeper. And by the way, guys, what you're hearing is a tiny touch of even this concept, where if you really want to go down the rabbit hole, definitely enroll in this new quest with Ken Wilber. Now, Ken, there are a couple of other ideas, including showing up, cleaning up, and opening up.
Yes.
Can we quickly touch on these?
Yes. Cleaning up, because we were particularly focusing on spirituality, cleaning up is another one of those areas that, astonishingly, it really was in its deepest, most profound understanding. This is also a notion that wasn't discovered until around 100 years ago. So growing up, literally the first person that came up with a model of psychological growing up that actually had stages of development with different lines of development was James Mark Baldwin. And this was right around 1900. His colleague, William James, was writing books like The Varieties of Religious Experience. He was studying waking up. James Mark Baldwin was studying growing up. And they were both friends and colleagues. They didn't realize exactly how they were, doing important things. One was doing waking up, one was doing growing up. But those were two very, very important researches that were being made in America. These are being studied until fairly recently. But then there was another very, very important item that you find in almost all spirituality and in all spiritual seekers. It's almost never dealt with correctly, and it causes absolute catastrophe. And that's cleaning up. In 1895, Freud wrote his first book. So you can see that's just a bit over 100 years ago. Right about the same time, James Mark Baldwin was discovering growing up. So the one thing that you can be sure of is any of the major spiritual systems anywhere in the world don't have growing up and they don't have cleaning up. And that's a disaster. Waking up, right on the mark. Growing up and cleaning up, not. Cleaning up deals with the actual repression, a psychodynamic repression of powerful emotional tends and drives and instincts. And they don't just go away when you repress them. They show up in extremely painful, problematic areas. And they start to distort your entire perception. They start to change your personality profoundly because it's an actual part of you that you've now lied about. You are denying it's yours. You're claiming, oh, I don't have that. So maybe there's this enormous amount of sexual impulse coming up. But for some reason, maybe my parents, maybe my religion, whatever reason, that's dangerous, that's wrong. I'm not supposed to have that. I push it out of awareness. And so one of the common things that happens is we project it. So we know somebody has this enormous amount of sexual feeling. It can't be me, so it must be somebody else, anybody else, just not me. So you project it on to somebody, and now they have all your sexuality, and not surprisingly, it's aimed at you. So they're always trying to come on to you, and they're always, at least you think. And the only reason it's aimed at you is it's your sexuality. It's not theirs. So the problems come about with, let's say you have a very self-controlling tendency, but you're not very much aware of it. You're working for a boss. Your boss, a little bit self-controlling. So when you project your self-controlling onto your boss now has two sources of self-controlling. He's got his own self-controlling, which is bad enough, but now he's got yours aimed at you. So he's got a double dose of self-control. This will drive you nuts. The actual symptoms that were created by repressing our shadow elements, Freud had an inner circle that included Carl Jung, who Freud had actually named his crown prince and successor, Alfred Adler, Otto Rank. Rank invented a term for people that had repressed their shadow and were being besieged by emotional problems. And he called those emotional problems, he invented a term called neurosis. And that's what was discovered about 100 years ago, was that we have neurosis.
So cleaning up covers the entire spectrum of shadow work.
It does.
And healing our wounds.
So when we push these drives out of ourselves, one of the most common things we do, again, is put them onto other people. And it's not that those people don't have those characteristics. We often, when we're projecting our own disowned qualities, we'll find somebody who has a fair amount of them because they act like a good hook. It's believable. So if you're self-controlling and you're projecting that, you sort of look around for somebody that's doing it. Oh, your boss is self-controlling. You can project it onto him. But what happens is then you react in a way that's just overwhelming because you're getting a double dose. He's watching over you all the time. He's trying to control everything you're doing. And that's just going to get you in trouble because, first of all, it's not true. He's not doing it to that degree. So here's an absolutely classic research project based on how people can take their own impulses when they're unaware of them and project them onto others. This research took a group of zealous, anti-gay religious believers. These were men, fundamentalists, who spent their life trying to stop gay rights from having any sort of influence in the world. So the researchers took these anti-gay zealots and showed them pictures of gay erotica. And what they found is that these anti-gay zealots, when shown pictures of gay erotica, were more sexually aroused than the average straight man was. In other words, these anti-gay zealots had their own enormous homosexual impulses, but they couldn't accept it in themselves, so they projected them onto gay men. And then they tried to get rid of their shadows by getting rid of gay men.
Wow.
That's a classic case of projection. And the shadow boxing that you do when you put your shadow out there and you start boxing it. It's not there.
Amazing.
Not in the way you see it.
That is the concept of cleaning up.
So part of what we're looking at when we're looking at spirituality is that previously it tended to be looked at as just take up this practice of waking up, do mindfulness, do Zen, do Christian centering prayer. Just do these things that are going to help you focus your awareness and bring you closer and closer to waking up enlightened states of being. But then we have these other areas that are at least as important, because you want to know where you are in growing up. You don't want to just end up being an enlightened Nazi. And with 70% of the population at ethnocentric or lower, you've got, unfortunately, at least there's a chance that you have that kind of growing up. And the problem is, waking up won't address it at all.
So we have to wake up, grow up, clean up. Now, we have talked about three aspects of the Ackwell framework. It goes so much deeper.
Yeah.
Tell us about showing up.
So we're talking about spirituality and the importance of, if you want a truly comprehensive spirituality, you want to really cover the bases, this is going to make a big difference in how authentic your spirituality is. That you do want to include these other areas, such as growing up and such as cleaning up. And then there are other areas, and I'm just going to mention these briefly. We can find more about them in the course. But there's what we call showing up. And this has to do with, there really are 4 or so fundamental dimensions of existence. These have been known about for a while. They have a lot of different forms. So they come up as things like the good, the true, and the beautiful, or art, moral, science, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. They actually also refer to first person, second person, third person pronouns that we find in all of the sophisticated languages. Now, it just turns out that each one of those areas gives us a very different view of any topic we're looking at. And the argument in academia has always been, oh, is this first person view right? Or no, is the second person view right? Or, oh, no, this third person, objective view, that's what's right. And the integral answer is no, they're all right. And each of them has to do with an enormously, profoundly significant area of endeavor. This certainly applies to spirituality as well. Just using first, second, and third person. A third person approach to spirituality is just talking about what it could be. So you could say spirit is a great web of life. And that's just an objective third-person account of what spirit looks like. You can also, more people have like conversations with God. And whether you think you're actually talking with God or not, these are enormously helpful practices just to get you to dialogue with what you think could be an ultimate spirit. So you have Neil Donald Walsh, of course, made a ton off his conversations with God. That's a fairly legitimate approach to spirituality, just as talking about the web of life and all that is. So one's a third person, one's a second person, and then there are first person approaches to spirituality. And by the way, first person means the person speaking, I, me, mine. Second person means the person being spoken to, you or thou. Third person is the person or thing being spoken about. Him, her, it, its. So those are objective. You is an immediate personal interaction, a conversation with. And first person is a spirituality that looks for spirit in the core of your own being. In other words, ultimate reality is your true self. You can discover that ultimate reality by inquiring into your own awareness. And that's where things like mindfulness and self-inquiry and meditation comes into play.
So this idea of showing up really helps us, in this sense, in the sense of spirituality, understand the relationship between, say, different variations of God.
Yes.
The personal God, the internal God, the God as the universe, the God as an identity, as a character, correct?
Yes.
But it can also be applied to a whole range of other fields.
Right.
Now, one of the things I want to stress to you guys is that when you go into this program, we're going to be looking at 5 different aspects of being human. We're going to look at mind, body, spirit, relationship, and career. Those are 5 really important aspects about life. We want to make these ideas practical to you, not just if you're a philosopher or a world leader, but a person just living life, trying to succeed at your best, grow at your best, and contribute your best. You're going to learn how to apply these ideas. And so far we've spoken of waking up, growing up, cleaning up, and showing up. And we're going to apply this plus other ideas from integral theory into your mind, your body, your spirit, your relationship, and your career. So you're going to get to look forward to that when you enroll in the program. So now we've covered showing up, but there's one more.
The last one is opening up, and some people take this as sort of not the most important, but in some ways it's really important. And that's the understanding that we've had recently, that human beings don't have just one intelligence. It was very common to think that, until recently, human beings had just one intelligence. It was often called cognitive intelligence. It was measured by the all-important IQ tests. Then we started finding that, wait, we actually have a lot of other different types of intelligences. So we have emotional intelligence, moral intelligence, interpersonal intelligence, aesthetic intelligence, spiritual intelligence, musical intelligence. And unfortunately, in today's culture, the only 2 types of intelligences that are actually educated for are verbal and cognitive. That's what you get taught in school. The SAT scores measures just those 2. So if you are good in one of those 2, then your school, your education system will think you're smart, you're bright. But if you're good in any of those other dozen intelligences, and you're not good in cognitive or verbal, you're looked at as basically being an idiot. But you could be a genius in emotional intelligence. You could be brilliant in aesthetic intelligence. You could have staggering gifts in spiritual intelligence. You could have enormous gifts in musical intelligence. And good luck for you if you have these intelligences that just don't happen to be one of the 2 chosen ones. I have yet to meet a person who didn't excel in at least one of those other intelligences.
That's a powerful insight. Thank you, Ken.
Yes.
So what happens when you go into this program and you learn the concept of opening up is you get to tap into other dimensions of intelligence. The way you approach problems in the world and the way you live life in those 5 areas, which I'll repeat for you: mind, body, spirit, relationships, and career, magnify, because you're tapping into other aspects of your gifts. Now, thank you, Ken, for sharing all of this with us. And guys, I know it's an intense conversation, right? But we are dealing with one of the most profound, brilliant minds of our generation. And that's why I'm so grateful that we have you in this program. And I'm so grateful that we get to capture your knowledge. And I'm also so grateful that your life is about to be turned into a major movie. That is incredible.
Yes.
And I know that's going to help get tons of other people interested in this work, which has changed my life so profoundly. So if you've joined us at this masterclass, I hope you got a ton out of it. Now let me tell you what's going to happen if you decide to go to the next level and enroll in our 35-day program with Ken Wilber. So our Mindvalley programs are known as having the highest completion rates in the industry. And that's because our Quest learning platform is one of the most advanced learning platforms in the world. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Quest, this is the basic way it works. Everybody starts the program at the same time. It's 35 days in micro learning chunks. That means you spend between 5 to 20 minutes a day for 35 days getting lessons from Ken. The reason we space it out this way is because we're bringing in behavioral psychology and actual ways that influence how you view the world. So you develop a fine layering and complexity in terms of your worldview. You don't just go through 8 hours of learning and then forget. What we're doing is building in transformation. Day by day, week by week, your sense of self is transforming. You're becoming wiser, smarter, more developed. And by spacing it out over 35 days, we are creating healthy habits. So at the end of 35 days, you will have completed the program with a community of thousands of other students who have started with you and are now going to be finishing with you. They cross the finishing line with you. They are with you for these 35 days in our online community, sharing insights and ideas. And you cannot help but be truly transformed when you wake up on day 36. You become a new person. So I want to give the audience a quick idea of what's going to be happening week by week. There's going to be an introduction and a warm-up. And then week 1, you go deep into the integral approach. You will learn the definition of integral theory, its 5 elements and 3 guiding principles. Week 2, you go into the integral mind. You learn about showing up and the quadrants, growing up and levels, cleaning up and shadows. By week 3, you've gone into integral spirit. This is where we cover the 3 faces of God, the 5 views of God, and waking up and states of waking up. Week 4, we go into integral body. This is where you learn about the gross, subtle, and causal body. And week 5, we go into integral relationships and integral work. You learn about integral work and business, the culture wars, a concept called iGen, and the integral project. And I want you to know, I did this quest for myself. I wanted to go deeper in Ken's work because of the magnificent impact you've had on my life over the last decade. And I made it my mission to work with you to create one of the best ways that I could introduce millions of people to your work. But I'm doing it also for myself. I'm designing this and building this and funding this project because I want this and I want my little boy doing this when he's old enough.
Yeah.
So I want to give you a picture of what's going to happen after you go through this program. As you go deeper in integral theory, you can think of this map that I'm putting up on screen right now as a way you will start looking at your life. You will start looking at your life beyond just classic personal growth. You will start looking at everything from emotions to knowledge to prayer to congruence. You will look at exercise in a different way. There's actually an integral approach to exercise. You will look at renewal, at sex, at relationships, at work, money, parenting, diet, and ethics in a different way. You become a far more advanced human being, for lack of a better word. It's like upgrading your operating system from 5 to 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10. I cannot express to you how this changes the way you function in the world. And also, you'll be able to have really mesmerizingly intelligent conversations with other people who have taken this program. And the rest of the world, they just won't understand us. So, welcome to the club. Now, Ken, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And go ahead and get the special enrollment price available on this page. Now, we know that some of you may not know if this program is right for you, so you can enroll. You can give yourself a refund by going to mindvalley.com/refund. And just give yourself a refund. It's automatic. So you don't even have to think if this is right for you. I like to live life based on the idea that every month I've grown so much that people whom I haven't seen in a month have to get to know me all over again. So I think that's a really good philosophy of living.
That is a good philosophy.
This quest is going to do that for you. People whom you have not seen in a month are really going to be blown away by the new you that they discover. They're going to have to get to know you all over again. So I can't wait for you to get involved with this. Now, Ken is a living legend. Even Sebastian Siegel, the man who was producing that movie about you, told me that it took him years to be able to get in touch with you, right? And to get that audience with you. Because I know you have so many people who have been knocking at your door ever since you were 23.
That's right.
So this is really priceless knowledge. And the cost of enrollment in this program is probably going to be one of the greatest investments you ever make with your money. Actually, I want to say this will probably be the best thing you can spend your money on, because nothing beats investing in yourself. Just a second, guys. I know this is weird. I just jumped into my own masterclass, but I wanted to update you on a really cool innovation that we just released on Mindvalley, and it happened since I recorded that past episode. So what we find is that so many of our top students love the programs that they enroll in a second program, and a third program, and a fourth program. Because the fact is, once you get on a Mindvalley quest, you get so hooked. What we are really good at is making learning as exciting as a computer game. When you wake up every day and you're spending your 10 to 20 minutes with your designated trainer and you feel your life shift, it creates such a remarkable feeling. But what happens when you finish that program? Well, people come back to Mindvalley and they enroll in the second and the third program, but that can get expensive. So we launched something called Mindvalley All Access. And what this means is that you get access to everything for less than $2 a day. So what does this look like? Well, firstly, you now have access to the top teachers and trainers in the world. And every new teacher coming onto Mindvalley is automatically added to your account. You take a fun self-assessment, which will help you view your life from a holistic perspective and know what to focus on. You then choose your adventure, the program that you want to take. And it's only 5 to 20 minutes a day because our teachers are so effective. Every day, you are developing new skills, new attitudes, new mindsets, new beliefs. And at the end of each month, you've up-leveled. Maybe you're now reading 3 times as fast, or your health is completely transformed, or you've improved your spiritual abilities for energy healing or manifesting. So many people forget that the number one thing that we need to do in life to achieve all our wildest dreams, to have career success, to give back to our family and the world, is to focus on becoming the best you can be. And this means investing in your personal growth. Think about what that will do for your life and the lives of everyone you touch. Scroll down below and enroll in Mindvalley All Access. All our programs are going to be open and available to you, so you get to choose your own adventure. So Ken, these are some of the most common questions that we get from our audience. I'm going to ask them to you one by one. The first question is, you mentioned integral. Doesn't that just mean holistic? How is the integrative approach different from other holistic programs, and what do you mean by integral?
Yeah, because what we found is that holistic has an enormous number of meanings, and each of them can get deeper and deeper and deeper and more inclusive and more inclusive. So if you take something, for example, like the Great Web of Life, that's very much a holistic concept. But what you have if you just have a belief in the holistic web of life is, okay, how much do you have to do to not just think about that as an object and actually realize that you are one with the reality that that represents? That's not necessarily contained whenever you just see a holistic web of life. Or when people talk about it, they don't often say, oh, and you have to realize your oneness with this whole web of life if it's to be true. So that's not included in typical holism. When it comes to the actual strands in the web of life, each of us is supposed to be a strand. But that strand is just looked at an objective kind of string that connects, itself to this strand and that strand and that strand and that strand. But how about those strands having awareness? How about those strands having your first-person consciousness? How about those strands interacting with others in first person to second person to third person? That's not included in any standard theory of the web of life. So all of those areas are getting left out. And arguably, those are the most important parts. It's not just that there's an interacting web, it's how do human beings actually interact with that web? What various types of dimensions or aspects or areas need to be included that you don't just see on that web. So there's holism, and then there's holism. And we try to do holism.
Thank you, Ken. Next question. Question 2 is on framework. Isn't this just another fancy life or personal development categorization framework? What's so special about the integral framework?
Yes. Well, there again, if you just lay out areas of living, then again, those are just third-person objective areas. And you can just look at them and you can go, okay, well, I should improve on that, or I should improve on that, or I should deal with that, or so on. But what we found is that there are at least 5, 6, 7 different dimensions to those areas of life. And each one of those tells us something profoundly new and different about each of those areas. And so these new dimensions and understandings can only be gathered by studying an enormous number of other disciplines that actually deal with those. And that's not clear at all from just the wheel of life. So again, there's integral, and there's integral, and we're trying to actually take something like that. We're not saying that's wrong. We're saying it's incomplete. More stuff needs to be added to really get at these absolutely core dimensions of what it means to be human.
So question 3, Ken, is that integral theory can be heavily theoretical or philosophical, which of course has its place, but what are its practical implications in body, mind, spirit, relationship, and work?
Well, one of the ways that people will talk about an integral approach is, and this just deals with quadrants and levels. We also have, at least for those who know the theory, we have quadrants and levels and lines and states and types. But if you look at just quadrants and levels, then what this means is you want to engage this approach in both your mind, body, and spirit as those show up in self, culture, and nature. So those are very simple sounding areas, but those cover most of the areas of your life. And so when you're actually saying, okay, what are the ingredients that go into making a self-development in an area of mind, or in a spiritual area, or in a simple bodily area? What are the interior dimensions and areas and aspects that need to be included in that? So you can make this very simple, you can make it very complex. But what they're dealing with are the absolute fundamental issues of life. Your life, the way they're lived right now. Your body, your mind, your spirit, your relationships, your work, your parenting, your nutrition, all of those are dealt with in this integral approach. And using aspects that we've learned by studying virtually all the other major areas and disciplines that would tell us anything about those areas. So it becomes a way to live your life with the best amount of intelligence that we possibly can. And it doesn't mean you have to be just abstract and heady. It just means smart things to do to make every ingredient in your life better.
Awesome. Question number 4 is on you as an author. Why you, Ken? Apart from your achievements as a philosopher, writer, and teacher, what makes you uniquely qualified to bring this important message to the world?
Well, I suppose in a certain sense, and for reasons I don't know, but I've been the one that was willing to do it. I'm just the one that ended up working in this area. there was, not many people know about something called A Course in Miracles, but it was sort of channeled to this woman named Helen Schuchman. And she herself never believed the material. And the material claimed to be the voice of Jesus Christ. And it was writing down all this material. And at one point, she finally said, "Why me?" And the voice simply said, "Because you'll do it." And it was just that simple. Because in part, I could ask, "Why me?" And the answer was, "Because you'll do it, idiot." So I ended up doing that. Started with my first book when I was 23, and I've been doing it for 50 years. So that's given me some amount of expertise on these topics as I've gone forward.
Thank you. And question 5. Who would you say this is for and why? What type of person in what life situation stands to benefit most from this program?
Well, this is one of the things that has been, in a sense, fairly unique about Integral. It claims to be one of the first world philosophies taken from both East and West, and that covers most of the major different disciplines that human beings engage in, actually shows how they fit together. And that's very rare. I mean, you just don't find those types of approaches very much in today's world. What it does mean is that it's literally applicable to virtually every major human discipline. So on the one hand, that makes it sound very complex, which is true, but we've applied it now to over 60 major human disciplines. So that gives us things like integral medicine, integral art, integral history, integral psychotherapy, integral relationships, integral counseling, integral business, integral politics, integral education. Where does it apply? To anybody interested in any of those. But it also applies just to you as an average person. If you want to wake up, if you want to grow up, if you want to handle shadow material and help clean up a bit, these are straightforward areas that you can use to apply to your own life. You don't have to use all of them. You can just look at what's offered, take snippets from here and here and here, and apply them, and check and see if they work. All of the recommendations that I've put into all of these areas come from a large number, a large community of experts and authorities and knowledge seekers that know these areas well. And I have included literally hundreds of different areas. I made none of them up. I got all of them from people that have done an enormous amount of research on them. The evidence for these areas is overwhelming. And so the question is, all you have to do, it's like a menu. You can just set it out on your table and go, okay, here's 100 things that I could work on. I'll do 3. That's fine. It means 3 things you're going to have a chance to improve that otherwise you wouldn't. And you can use other ways to do it as well. That's the whole point. We just make a place for everything. And so we say, making room for everything. And when you make room for everything, then you're allowed to start including everything. And when you make room for everything, everything starts to get better. So that it can be used by anybody to any degree that they want to.
Question number 6 is on outcomes. What is the primary learning outcome of this quest? And what will people be able to do once they finish this 35-day program?
An understanding of just how big this world is. It's one of the most astonishing things that most of the items that human beings believe in, that they believe really exist, that they would say is part of the real world, 99.9% of those things nobody has ever actually experienced themselves directly. Nobody's experienced an electron or an atom or a molecule or a cell, or brain neurophysiology, or distant planets. But we think they're all real. We say, oh yeah, those are real. You've never seen them. You don't know if they're real or not. But 99.9% of our knowledge is like that. It turns out that when it comes to human beings as well, there are so many things that are part of us that we don't know, that we almost can't see, that we have no idea are there. And so, of course, we can't act on them. We can't improve them. We can't self-develop them. We can't even meet them with awareness. We have no clue they're there. So what we're trying to do with Integral is simply say, okay, just like this world has atoms and molecules and cells and organisms and neuronal systems and all of that, your own being has these various areas. And if you find those areas, then you can engage them. You can actually wake up. You can actually grow up. You can actually clean up and show up and open up. And those become available once you find out these ingredients are actually in your own being and awareness. You can't see them now. You don't know about them now, just like you don't know about atoms and molecules and cells. But they're there. There are ways to find out about them. And when you do that, your own life becomes absolutely overwhelming and full of an abundance of the treasures that those ingredients have for your own being. And that's an astonishing, astonishing thing. In a sense, you become wealthier and wealthier and wealthier, not necessarily in gold or diamonds or jewels, but in the ingredients that make your life full and complete and free and happy.
Thank you, Ken. And the final question, why now? Why is this such an important program for people to do in the world today?
We are, well, I would give just a blanket overall statement, and then I'll give you specifically what I think. The blanket statement is the more knowledge of these hidden treasures that we all have, that's just a good in itself. Finding out about those are good in itself. And we can think 500 years from now or 1,000 years from now, the number of these things that we've discovered will have exploded. But if we just look at the ingredients in Integral right now, most of them aren't even known by most of the people in our culture right now. Most college professors know almost nothing about the actual stages of development and growing up. Most of them know nothing about an actual enlightenment or awakening or waking up experience. Most of them are actually unaware of these treasures that we have. And so that's a problem. So one of the things that we need right now in order to help human beings develop, discover, and find these treasures in themselves, that's one of the main things one of the main reasons that we need to know about an integral approach. But one of the really crucial ones is that our culture right now is facing more polarization than it has in, well, certainly as long as it's been tested for. I mean, it's really brutal. And there's nothing on the horizon that shows any counterbalance to that polarization. It's just getting worse and worse and worse. And there's no big shining thing that's coming along saying, oh, here, this is going to help us unite and integrate and stop this retribalization and this brutal polarization. One of the few things that looks like it can are some of these elements that we talk about in Integral, because those are continuing to grow and develop. And some of them are at a point, quite high stages of development, that involve unifying forces, literally integrating forces, unifying forces. And as those continue to emerge in our culture, those are going to be elements that actually fight polarization. It's the only thing I can see on the horizon that has any chance of slowing, even reversing, possibly, that kind of polarization. And if we don't stop that polarization, there are very sober social critics saying today that if it keeps going, that's headed towards a real civil war. So if that's what we want, fine, keep it up. If not, try to put some of these counterbalancing forces into place. And foremost among those, as far as I can see anywhere on the horizon, is an integral understanding that more and more people would adopt. And that would make a profound difference.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you, everyone, and thank you for those wonderful questions. I hope this gives you a better idea of what you can expect from this program. Thanks all. Thank you for joining us. Thanks for being part of this program. I cannot wait to see you in this quest.